I remember walking up the familiar path to our family home, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of pine and roasting turkey. Everything looked just as it always had. Orange and brown leaves scattered across the yard, the old wooden porch with the wreath Dad insisted on hanging every year, the warm glow of the living room spilling through the windows. In my mind, Thanksgiving had always been a day of comfort, laughter, and belonging. I expected hugs, jokes, and the small arguments that somehow felt like tradition. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. A subtle shift in the air. A tension that had always been there, but was now impossible to ignore. My parents' smiles seemed measured, my siblings' laughter a little too forced. And then there was him, my younger brother, grinning as though he owned the room, soaking in every compliment and attention that should have been shared, or at least evenly distributed. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself I was imagining things, but the way Dad's eyes lingered on him, the gentle praise Mom offered him while barely glancing at me, it stung. It was as if every joke, every story, every memory I had of being cherished here had been quietly rewritten. I laughed when prompted, nodded politely, but inside, a cold seed of unease began to take root. Something had shifted. Something I wasn't allowed to name yet. I carried my plate to the table, noticing my chair slightly farther from the center, and felt that all too familiar ache of being overlooked, undervalued, and somehow less important than the person sitting just across from me. I had walked into a room I had loved for decades, only to realize that love wasn't shared equally anymore, and perhaps it never had been. The holiday warmth I expected was already a fragile illusion, cracking before the feast had even begun. I barely had time to swallow my first bite before Dad's voice cut through the chatter, sharp and deliberate. "We're selling the family business," he announced, his eyes flicking over everyone, finally settling on me. "And you're getting nothing." The words hit me like a punch I couldn't see coming. For a moment, I thought I misheard him, that maybe the stress of the holidays had twisted his meaning. But no, the finality in his tone left no room for doubt. My stomach sank, my fork clattering against the plate. My siblings froze, some exchanging glances, others grinning in a way that made my blood boil. My brother, that smug little shadow I'd always felt behind, leaned back in his chair, chest puffed, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "Seriously?" I whispered, disbelief choking me. "Nothing at all?" Mom's face was unreadable, a tight smile barely masking what I suspected was agreement. Cousins murmured, some sympathetic, others intrigued by the drama unfolding. "You've worked so hard," I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. "And this is how I'm repaid?" Dad's expression didn't waver. "We've made our decision. You weren't cut out to run it anyway." A mixture of shame and anger bubbled in me, a poisonous cocktail I tried desperately to suppress. My brother smirked wider, teasing, "Guess some of us are just born to win, huh?" Laughter echoed from the table, a cruel backdrop to the humiliation that wrapped around me like a vice. I felt invisible, betrayed, and exiled in the one place I thought I belonged, as every subtle slight from my past seemed magnified, and every promise of family loyalty felt like a lie. I retreated into myself, sitting there with my hands gripping the edge of the table, trying to make sense of the words that had just ripped through the room. How could they do this? How could Dad, who had always preached about family loyalty and hard work, turn around and treat me like a stranger? My mind flashed back to every late night I'd spent helping with the business, the weekends I sacrificed to cover mistakes that weren't even mine, the countless hours I'd devoted to learning, building, and protecting what we had. I remembered the sleepless nights I'd endured to balance school, work, and family expectations, all while watching my brother coast by with praise and indulgence for doing far less. The injustice pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating, each memory a fresh pang of betrayal. I imagined every decision I'd made with care, every ounce of effort I had poured in, and felt it dismissed, erased, as if it had never mattered. My anger simmered beneath the surface, coiling tighter with each passing second, but it was mingled with disbelief, heartbreak, and a deep, aching loneliness. The warmth of Thanksgiving, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the forced smiles, felt like a cruel mockery now. I realized bitterly that the family I had trusted, The people I had given myself to had never truly seen me as equal. And yet somewhere in that betrayal, a spark ignited. I refused to let this be the end of my story. I refused to let them define my worth, to dictate the outcome of my life. Something had to change, and I silently vowed to myself that when the time came, they would see the person they had underestimated, and they would regret it. As I sat there, the humiliation still burning, my mind couldn't help but wander through the years of subtle, relentless favoritism. I remembered birthdays where my brother's achievements were celebrated with grand gifts and attention, while my own successes were met with polite nods or a passing comment. At every school recital, every promotion, every small triumph I had quietly earned, the spotlight somehow found him, leaving me in the shadows. I recalled family gatherings where my ideas were dismissed in front of relatives, laughed off as if I were dreaming too big, while he was praised for even the smallest effort. There were moments of public embarrassment too, like the time I was reprimanded in front of the entire extended family for a mistake that wasn't mine. Or when a cousin, egged on by Dad, made a snide remark about my frugality compared to my brother's generosity. I had always tried to laugh it off, to maintain composure, but each memory was a fresh wound. It was a pattern I could no longer ignore. I was always overlooked, replaced, underestimated. And now, with the business stripped from me, the pattern had reached its cruelest form yet. The family I had devoted myself to had never truly acknowledged my worth, and that realization left a hollow ache, fueling a sense of righteous indignation. I felt the sting of being unseen, the quiet desperation of trying to prove myself to people who had never believed I deserved recognition. And yet, the very injustice that had haunted me for years was beginning to ignite a plan, a quiet resolve that someday they would understand exactly what they had lost. I spent the next few days in a haze, walking through the house, replaying every conversation, every slight, every overlooked opportunity. I knew reacting openly would only play into their hands, so I retreated into quiet observation, listening for patterns, noting weaknesses, and calculating possibilities. I dug through old business records I had once helped maintain, looking for overlooked contracts, forgotten debts, or opportunities that had slipped through the cracks. My mind buzzed with strategies, ideas bouncing around like pieces on a chessboard, each move carefully considered before committing. Every time I uncovered a small inconsistency, a loophole, or a missed obligation, my confidence grew. Maybe this wasn't the end. It could be the beginning of something they never expected. I imagined the satisfaction of quietly reclaiming control, turning their assumptions about me into the very leverage I would need. Late at night, I'd replay scenarios in my head, weighing risks and outcomes, testing each step against what I knew of their personalities. It was exhilarating, almost intoxicating to feel the scales tip ever so slightly in my favor. I smiled at small victories no one would ever notice yet, a silent promise to myself that the game had only just begun. Every observation, every whispered detail from family and staff added another piece to the puzzle, and I felt the tension tighten, a thrill of anticipation coiling in my chest. For the first time in years, I sensed that their certainty of my inferiority was about to become their greatest mistake. Weeks of careful observation and quiet planning finally bore fruit. I discovered that one of Dad's longtime business partners had been skimming profits, assuming no one would notice because the partner trusted my father's favoritism toward my brother would keep me out of the loop. Instead of confronting them directly, I bided my time, gathering emails, contracts, and proof of discrepancies. I knew exposure had to be precise, undeniable, and delivered at the perfect moment. One afternoon, I invited the partner to discuss a minor operational concern, keeping my tone casual, my questions innocuous, all while slipping in pointed observations that hinted I knew more than I should. The partner's confidence wavered, their smugness cracking as I revealed key evidence, methodically, almost conversationally, letting the weight of my findings settle. By the end of the meeting, they had no choice but to admit wrongdoing and commit to rectifying it under my terms, effectively handing me leverage within the business without my family ever realizing how it had happened. I walked away from that encounter with a quiet thrill, savoring the subtle taste of victory. For the first time, I felt the shift of power in my hands, proof that I was not powerless, that their assumptions about me had blinded them. The excitement of this small but undeniable triumph fueled a deeper confidence, and I knew it was only the beginning. The first piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and the larger game, the reckoning, was already taking shape. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere at family gatherings became increasingly tense. My brother couldn't resist flaunting his latest achievements: a new luxury car, a high-profile client he claimed to have landed, a vacation abroad, all subtle reminders of what I supposedly lacked. Every boast was a calculated jab, a way to remind everyone, especially me, who he thought deserved the spotlight. My parents, oblivious or indifferent, nodded along, praising him while my own accomplishments remained footnotes, unacknowledged. I felt the familiar surge of anger, the old sting of being overlooked. But this time I forced myself to stay calm, to measure my response. Every emotional impulse I resisted became another layer of strategic advantage. I had to act carefully. Any rash move could reveal my intentions too soon or give them ammunition against me. Late at night, I wrestled with frustration, debating internally whether to confront them directly or continue to gather evidence and leverage. Each scenario played out in my mind, weighing risks, moral implications, and potential outcomes. The tension was suffocating, yet intoxicating. The power imbalance I had endured for so long was beginning to unravel, and I could almost taste the shift. Patience had become my weapon, and restraint my silent rebellion. Every insult, every boast, every casual dismissal was now ammunition for the day I would finally tip the scales. It was late one night when I stumbled across it, an overlooked clause buried deep in the business contracts, a tiny loophole my father had never considered. As I read, my heart pounded with a mixture of disbelief and elation. Years of careful planning, meticulous bookkeeping, and sleepless nights had prepared me for this moment. The clause revealed that the sale of the family business couldn't proceed without unanimous consent from all heirs, a technicality my father had assumed I would never discover, a detail he had buried beneath layers of legalese and overconfidence. My mind raced as I realized the implications. Not only could I block the sale, but I could also gain leverage to claim authority in decisions he thought were untouchable. I pictured Dad's smug expression, the satisfaction he had taken in publicly declaring I would inherit nothing, and a rush of determination surged through me. But it wasn't just the legal advantage. It was proof of how recklessly he had underestimated me, proof that arrogance can blind even those in power. My pulse quickened as I imagined presenting this knowledge at the perfect moment, watching the shock ripple across the room, the gasps, the stammered excuses. This discovery was more than a tool. It was validation, a confirmation that all those years of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated had not been wasted. I felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with the adrenaline of plotting the perfect timing. I knew this revelation could change everything, turning the very foundation of my family's dominance on its head. And as I closed the folder, my mind already rehearsing every angle, I felt the first taste of true control, my opportunity to rewrite the narrative, to shift from victim to orchestrator, was finally within reach. Thanksgiving arrived, and I felt a mix of nerves and exhilaration as I walked into the house. The aroma of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the air, but I barely noticed it. My focus was on what was about to unfold. I had prepared meticulously, armed with documents, emails, and contracts that exposed every misstep, every greed-fueled decision my father had tried to hide. My siblings chatted and laughed, oblivious to the storm quietly gathering. I set my plate down with deliberate calm, letting my presence command attention without a word. Finally I spoke, my voice steady, projecting both authority and control. Before we begin, I need to address something important about the family business. The room fell silent. Dad's eyes narrowed, his confident facade cracking, while my brother's smirk faltered. I laid out the evidence, piece by piece, explaining the loophole, the mismanagement, and the partner who had been bending rules under their noses. The murmurs started among cousins and uncles, disbelief spreading like wildfire. I could see the shift in body language. Dad's jaw tightened, and my brother's usual swagger evaporated. The hypocrisy, the favoritism, the years of dismissing my contributions, all laid bare in front of everyone. When I finished, the silence was deafening, punctuated only by my measured breathing. Dad attempted a weak objection, but the document spoke louder than any argument. My brother's embarrassment was palpable, his usual confidence replaced by the realization that I had not only caught their mistakes, but also turned their arrogance into my advantage. The family I had felt powerless against for decades now stared at me differently, a mixture of shock, guilt, and awe washing over them. For the first time, I saw respect in their eyes, not the hollow, polite kind, but the undeniable acknowledgement of my intelligence, resilience, and rightful claim. In that moment, everything changed. The tables had turned, and the very people who had humiliated me for years were finally confronted with the consequences of their choices. It was a long-awaited reckoning, and the satisfaction I felt was both exhilarating and deeply cathartic. Thanksgiving had become the stage not for their celebration, but for justice, and I had orchestrated it flawlessly. The weeks following that Thanksgiving were surreal. I wasn't just the overlooked child anymore. I was the one holding the cards. The business remained under my influence, and decisions I had once been denied control over were now mine to direct. The financial reversal was satisfying. Of course, profits shifted, partnerships realigned, and assets I'd never expected were now secure under my guidance. But it was the emotional and social vindication that truly consumed me. Family members who had once dismissed my input now sought my opinion, flustered and unsure how to navigate a world where I was no longer the inferior sibling. The power dynamics had flipped entirely, and I could feel it in every glance, every hesitant word, every calculated compliment offered too late. My brother, once smug and confident, now avoided my eye, aware that he had underestimated me for far too long. Dad's pride was visibly shaken, his attempts at authority rendered impotent by the very loophole he had ignored. I found a quiet satisfaction in knowing they had learned the consequences of their favoritism, greed, and arrogance, but I didn't gloat. Instead, I let their discomfort linger, a silent testament to the justice that had finally been served. There was a sweet thrill in their disbelief, the sense that I had orchestrated the perfect reversal, every slight, every insult, every past humiliation now balanced by my careful planning and patient execution. They never saw it coming, and that knowledge alone was intoxicating. In private moments, I reflected on the journey, the anger, the heartbreak, the sleepless nights of plotting, and realized that each step had strengthened me, honed my resolve, and taught me the value of patience and intelligence. The payoff wasn't just in money or status. It was in the deep, unshakable feeling of being seen and recognized, finally, on my own terms. The scales had been balanced, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly untouchable. The catharsis was complete, and the lesson was clear. Underestimation is a dangerous mistake, and justice, when delivered thoughtfully, is unavoidable. After the whirlwind of exposure and reversal, I found myself alone in the quiet of my home, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The victories were sweet, but the journey had left its mark. I thought about the fractures in my family, the relationships that might never heal, and the subtle pain of realizing that those who should have protected me had failed. There was no joy in their discomfort, only a recognition that their choices had forced me to take drastic measures. I also thought about myself, about the person I had become through this struggle. Stronger, sharper, more self-reliant, but also wary and guarded. Revenge had given me closure and empowerment, yet it had exacted a price in trust and innocence. I acknowledged the anger and pain that had fueled my actions, understanding now how necessary it had been to channel them carefully, to transform frustration into strategy. Amid the bittersweet mix of triumph and loss, I realized the ultimate lesson. Self-worth cannot be dictated by others, and justice, though sometimes delayed, is most satisfying when earned patiently. The experience reshaped my view of family, loyalty, and personal boundaries, leaving me with a quiet resilience and a sharper understanding of who I was and who I would never allow myself to be again. Sitting alone that evening, I let the silence settle around me, the echoes of family arguments and shocked faces still lingering in my mind. I realized that the victory wasn't just in money, status, or public recognition. It was in reclaiming my own narrative, in proving to myself that I could rise above neglect, favoritism, and betrayal. I thought about the lessons I had learned. Patience is power, observation is strength, and underestimation is a dangerous miscalculation. Yet, even as I savored the justice served, a subtle part of me smirked at the thought of lingering consequences for those who had doubted me. The little moments I had set in motion, the missed opportunities, the awkward glances, the quietly shifted power dynamics, were my invisible signature of revenge, subtle but unmistakable. I reflected on how different life could have been if they had chosen fairness, kindness, or recognition instead of arrogance and favoritism. But hindsight was irrelevant now. The game was over, and I had emerged unbroken, smarter, and undeniably in control. The bitterness of past neglect had transformed into a measured satisfaction, a quiet thrill that no one could take from me. And as I stared out the window at the fading autumn light, I felt a deep, unshakable certainty. I had survived their betrayal, mastered the game, and reshaped the rules on my own terms. The family that had tried to define me was left to reckon with their mistakes, and I was free, finally, irrevocably free, and more alive than ever.